I'm making this video to talk about the most regretful and shameful thing that I've ever had to talk about publicly.
Joe Rogan is by far no stranger to controversy. The man thrives on it, honestly. Even his audience has garnered a certain reputation as people who take masculinity very seriously and rigidly define themselves as traditional. The former UFC commentator turned game show host is not known for holding back any controversial opinions, and since forming his extremely successful podcast, he's had some colorful people on, so to speak. His more recent bout in hot water is also related to the kind of people he has on as guests, namely people who spread misinformation about serious topics. Because he's platforming these people on Spotify, whom he has an exclusive contract with, a bunch of artists are threatening to pull their music if he continues to be promoted. And now tons of videos of him saying slurs are coming to light, and these videos may just be what's needed to pull the plug on Joe Rogan's reign of the podcast world. Today we're covering controversial podcaster Joe Rogan. Tomorrow though, you decide. I'd love to hear in the comments down below who you think we should cover on the next episode of Where Are They Now, and please hit that like button if you enjoyed this video. Joseph Rogan was born in New Jersey. His dad was a cop who had a history of aggression to his kids. His parents divorced when Joe was only 5 years old, and he never saw him again after he turned 7. Quote, "All I remember of my dad are these brief violent flashes of domestic violence, but I don't want to complain about my childhood. Nothing bad ever happened to me. I don't hate the guy." For a few years he lived in California, before his mom moved to Florida and then finally settling in Massachusetts. When he was a kid, Joe participated in Little League Baseball and became interested in martial arts. It seems like martial arts became a source of confidence for Joe, who recalls feeling, quote, "terrified of being a loser." He stated that martial arts, quote, "gave me not just confidence but also a different perspective of myself and what I was capable of. I know that I could do something I was terrified of, and that was really difficult, and that I could excel at it. It was a big deal for me. Martial arts were the first thing that ever gave me hope that I wasn't going to be a loser." While it's still up for debate if Joe is a loser or not, he did do very well in martial arts in his teens. At 19 years old, he won the US Open Championship Taekwondo tournament as a lightweight and was a 4-time state champion. In his early 20s, however, Joe retired from competition because of frequent headaches and the fear that he might sustain worse injuries. Once he graduated high school, he tried going to the University of Massachusetts but dropped out pretty early. Feeling dejected and like he had no real path in life now that martial arts were no longer an option, Joe decided to start doing stand-up to take his mind off of things. He went to an open mic one night and just fell in love with the whole process. Now living in Boston, Joe worked various jobs to support himself while doing stand-up on the side. He worked as a martial arts instructor for kids, delivered newspapers, drove limos, basically anything to put food on the table. Meanwhile, in the comedy circle, Rogan started gaining notoriety for his blue comedy style, which blue comedy just means like gross, kind of indecent boy toilet humor. He started attracting gigs at bachelor parties and strip clubs before deciding to move to Los Angeles to pursue comedy full-time. While there, he began an acting role for a Fox sitcom called Hardball. He also did stand-up as a paid regular for a comedy club in Hollywood. In 1997, Joe began working for the UFC as a backstage and post-fight interviewer, but quit after 2 years because his salary didn't cover the cost of travel and he was losing more money than he was making. Then in 2001, a different company bought the UFC and Rogan eventually became friends with its now president Dana White. Dana offered Joe a job as a color commentator, which basically means the backup position to the primary play-by-play commentator. But Joe declined this opportunity because he wanted to go to fights and drink, not work. White managed to convince Joe to work as a commentator for free in exchange for prime event tickets for him and his buddies. Eventually, Joe became a full-on staff member and he worked alongside Mike Goldberg until the end of 2016 as a commentator for UFC events. Then in 2001, Joe became a host for the NBC show Fear Factor, mainly to find fodder for stand-up content. But the show gave him tons of recognition, and in turn, his stand-up gig turnout rose immensely. In December of 2009, Joe and fellow comedian Brian Redband began their podcast on a live weekly broadcast site called Ustream. A few months later, it was renamed The Joe Rogan Experience and began gaining traction on iTunes and Sirius Radio. The podcast featured tons of guests who just kind of chatted about anything from current culture to philosophy to comedy and pretty much any topic. By 2015, the podcast had been downloaded over 11 million times and became the most popular free podcast just out there. As the years went on, Joe became known for his no beating around the bush attitude. He's very politically outspoken, which obviously, because it's politics, made for a divisive argument around the controversial people he hosted on the podcast. Although he calls himself a libertarian, it's pretty obvious that that's not the case, and he more so jumps around different political leanings. While he supports gay rights and universal basic income, he's critical of trans people in sports and supports gun rights. He's also been a big supporter of Bernie Sanders, yet voted for Trump in the Biden versus Trump election. His views are interesting, and even if you don't agree with him, he does genuinely believe in hearing out both sides, which I think is an admirable trait. But in doing so, especially on a platform that is insanely huge, one risks giving credibility where credibility isn't really due. Like right now. In January 2022, Joe was criticized for having Dr. Robert Malone guest on the podcast. The doctor in question touts pseudoscience and is accused of spreading misinformation, so much so that he's already been banned on Twitter because of it. Most notably, on the podcast, he compared government regulations to the segregation that happened to Jewish people during World War II. Over 270 scientists, ranging from physicians to doctors to healthcare workers, signed a petition to Spotify, who has an exclusive contract with the Joe Rogan Experience now, to quote, establish a clear and public policy to moderate misinformation on its platform. In late January of 2022, Spotify hadn't issued any response to the outcry, and so a few artists took it in their own hands to do something. Neil Young, a polio survivor, felt extremely affected by Joe Rogan's platforming of conspiracy and fake science and told Spotify that it, quote, had the responsibility to mitigate the spread of misinformation on its platform. He also said that if something wasn't done, he would request that Spotify remove his music from their platform. Only a few days later, his music became no longer available on the music streaming service. Spotify replied with a statement that it had, quote, a great responsibility in balancing both safety for listeners and freedom of creators. Neil Young had about 6.1 million listeners on Spotify, while Joe Rogan had 11 million, and it seems like a lot of people are upset that a streaming platform seems to want to continue making more money over upholding any ethics. In response to Neil removing his music, Joni Mitchell also removed her catalog in support of her fellow Canadian musician and longtime friend. Joe Rogan himself said that while he wished it didn't come to this, he wants to get better at his role as an impartial party. As an interviewer, he understands that he needs to try harder to maintain a neutral point of view, and when he doesn't do so, he's aiding in the spread of false information. He agreed that Spotify should add a disclaimer to the beginning of his podcast. While I may not be the biggest fan of Joe Rogan, and I kind of side with Neil Young and Joni Mitchell on this case, I do think that Rogan has taken it pretty in stride. It's not like we can just ignore that his podcast is so insanely popular. Obviously, he's saying things that people connect with, otherwise it wouldn't be the most listened to podcast. So I don't think taking it down is the right idea, but I am glad that he's taking some personal blame for the situation, and I hope that he understands that by creating this role for himself as an interviewer, he needs to play by the rules set out for that role. Being impartial is the only way to ethically host all kinds of opinions, because once you inject your personal opinion onto the platform, it immediately becomes biased and sort of discredits anything you're trying to say. But only a few days ago, footage of Joe using the N-word started to surface. And I mean, not just a few times, but like many minute-long compilations of him saying the slur. It's interesting to see so many apologies coming from Joe, as he's usually quite unapologetic and has been for decades. But in this certain instance, he did release an apology video. In the apology, Joe says that, quote, for most people, saying the N-word in any context is wrong, never mind on a public podcast, and I agree with that now. But for a long time, if that word would come up in conversation, instead of saying the N-word, I would say the word. I thought as long as it was in context, people would understand what I was doing. Spotify also doubled down on their insistence to keeping Joe on their platform, stating, quote, while I strongly condemn what Joe has said and I agree with his decision to remove past episodes from our platform, I realize some will want more, and I want to make one point very clear. I do not believe that silencing Joe is the answer. Whether or not you agree with the statement, it opens up a whole can of worms that I think Spotify is worried will happen. If Joe is allowed on the platform, that means that a line needs to be created for the site, a line that contains tons of ambiguity no matter where you stand. It now has to decide whether offensive words are allowable everywhere, including outright racism, homophobia, and anti-immigrant stances. Even if Joe doesn't advocate for any of that, the people he platforms sometimes do, and Spotify needs to decide where that line is on what's appropriate for their platform. Joe saying the N-word, whether out of context or not, further entrenches him in controversy, the kind of controversy that large corporations try to avoid at all costs. It'll be interesting to see what comes as time goes on for both Joe Rogan and Spotify as a whole. So how do you feel about the videos of Rogan using slurs surfacing? Let us know in the comments down below, and please subscribe to this channel to receive more videos just like this one. I've been your host, Sierra. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Where Are They Now? See you next time.